Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video on environmental science and specifically going through food systems. Let's get started on this next video. So when we talk about food webs and food chains, what are food webs and food chains? When we think about these energy systems and these food systems, this is how other organisms are going to eat those other organisms. So as organisms feed on one another, matter and energy move through a community's trophic level. Now, an organism's trophic level is its rank in a feeding hierarchy. So if we think about this, primary producers are always going to make up a community's first trophic level. Then we have secondary, and then we have tertiary consumers that go on. So in theory, a community can have a number of trophic levels, and the relative amounts of energy and nutrients available at each trophic level are going to put restrictions on a community's structure. So when we're thinking about each of these food webs and food chains, we're thinking about its relationship with these trophic levels. So let's go through and look at a food chain first, because this is going to be the easiest to understand. A food chain, all it is a linear series of feeding relationships. So if we're thinking about a linear series here, we're talking about a bobcat going and consuming a rabbit here. Now we can look at an example of a food chain here. It's linear. Starts with a primary producer, so in this case we have algae. Then it moves on to our herbivores. So these are going to be our primary consumers here. These are our flagfish. And then as we move up this linear series here, we can see we're moving into our carnivores, or our secondary and then tertiary consumers. So the tuna will consume the flagfish, the seagull will consume some of the tuna, and then maybe the alligator here will go through and consume the seagull. And we can see that energy is being transferred as it moves through this food chain in a linear fashion. Now, food webs, these are going to be a little bit different. A food web goes through and it gives a system of interlocking and interdependent food chains. So what it's allowing you to do is see the relationship between all of these organisms and the pathway at which energy can flow amongst these organisms here. Now, food webs are going to have three important parts for us to go through and understand. We have to understand the directions of the arrows. We have to understand the 10% rule. And then we also have to understand one part of a food web is going to impact the entire part of a food web. So when we're thinking about this, we're looking at the food web in the next animation here. And we want to be thinking about these three components. So as we zoom in on this food web here, we're going to have to go through and look at the key. The key is going to consist of a few parts. We have each of these spheres, which is going to represent our scavengers, decomposers, detritivores, omnivores, carnivores, producers, and herbivores. We've looked at this in our previous series. Now, if we move on to these arrows here, we can see that this dotted arrow here, well, that is going to indicate that an organism or a plant was consumed after death. And then this arrow here with these circular dots is a detritus pathway, which we'll discuss in a second. So if we pull up our food web here, we have all of these different organisms living in an ecosystem and interacting, and they're consuming each other for energy. Now we can look at a couple different pathways here. The most common pathway that we're going to see in Pennsylvania is a deer that goes through and eats plants, and then maybe that bobcat goes through and eats the deer. And we can see the arrows indicate the transfer of energy, where the nutrients and energy are moving. So the deer consumes the plant, and we can see that the arrow indicates that the nutrients and energy are moving to that deer. Same thing for the bobcat. And we can also see that the deer has a red herbivore, so it's indicating here that behind it it's a herbivore, and then the plant in orange is a producer. Now if we look up here, we can see that this line, if this deer was to go through and die, the scavenger would go through and consume it, and the nutrients would be recycled. We can also look at a variety of other pathways. So we can look at this aquatic pathway where algae is consumed by the flagfish, which is consumed by the tuna, which then moves to the seagull, which then moves to the alligator. And we can see the transfer of energy that originally starts at the algae and moves to the alligator. We can also see that algae might be consumed by shrimp, which are then consumed by the tuna, or maybe consumed by the killfish here. And then as we move through these pathways, we can also see another pathway with an organism here, bacteria interacting with the crayfish. Crayfish is consumed by the frog. And then again, if we look here, the frog is consumed by the alligator. And when all of these organisms go through and they die, they are consumed by these scavengers or these detritivores. And we can see that this energy, remember, is being transferred amongst these organisms and then recycled into the system there. Now, lastly, here we want to look at this detritus pathway. When we talk about algae or plants that go through and die, normally what we're going to see is bacteria go through and break them down. So we can see that the vulture is going to go through and break down organic matter from animals, and the bacteria will go through and break down that plant and algal matter. So we can look at this and we can see that all of this is cyclical, which means it's recycled and the energy is moving from one organism to the next. Now, when we discuss this, we want to go through and look at the ecological pyramid. And the ecological pyramid is going to consist of these parts here. We can see it's a pyramid because it starts with producers at the bottom, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers at the top. And what that means here is we have our primary producers at the bottom, we have our herbivores here in the middle, then our secondary consumers, those are going to be our primary carnivores, and then we have our secondary carnivores here. And we can see that this pyramid here represents different levels of energy and different levels of energy transfer. And the actual size and shape of these blocks is important. Now, when we talk about energy transfer in an ecological pyramid, we want to think about it in this sense. Only 10% of the energy is transferred from primary producer to primary consumer, from primary consumer to secondary consumer, and from secondary consumer to tertiary consumer. As you move up the pyramid, we lose energy, and that energy is lost in the form of heat. So if we were to go through and give a hypothetical example here, what we would look at is, let's say we have our eagle, our frog, our grasshopper, and our plant. The plant is consumed by the grasshopper, the frog by the grasshopper, and the eagle by the frog. Let's say we have 1,000 energy units in this plant. Well, if the grasshopper goes through and consumes the plant, are all of 1,000 of those energy units going to transfer to the grasshopper? No, only 10% are transferred. So 10 energy units. Then to the frog only gets 1 energy unit of that original 1,000 from the plant. And then the eagle gets 0.1 energy units from the 1,000 energy units from the plant. And this is what I'm referring to when I say the 10% rule. The 10% rule states that only 10% of the energy is transferred to the next trophic level. Now, as a result of this energy transfer, what we're going to see is biomass is going to decrease as we move up these trophic levels here. So what we can see is, because energy is not necessarily going to be transferred efficiently through these trophic levels, just as it moves up from our primary producers to secondary consumers and so on, what we're going to see is we're going to see less and less of organisms as we move up these trophic levels here. So what we can see is biomass decreases as you move up the pyramid because there's energy loss as you're moving up from trophic level to trophic level. Now, all of these concepts are going to be related to our keystone species, and our keystone species are going to be what our topic of discussion is next. Now, a keystone species is a species on which other species in an ecosystem largely depend upon, such that if it were removed, the ecosystem would drastically change. Now, if we zoom in on this diagram on the left here, we can see that this arch is held up by this keystone. It's the stone in the center of the arch that all of the weight and pressure bears on. Now, if we were to go through and remove the arch or remove the stone that holds the arch together, what we would see is the entire arch would crumble because all of the weight and pressure bear upon that stone. That's why we call it a keystone species. It holds the entire ecosystem together, and with its removal, ecological collapse would occur. So we want to be thinking about this as we move into our next video and apply our food webs and food systems. So we're going to end the video here and then move into our keystone species, but we want to get a few things out of this lesson. Did you guys learn? Well, did you learn a couple of things? Did we learn what a linear food chain is? Did we learn what a food web is and how it applies to the 10% rule in biomass? And then lastly here, were you introduced to what a keystone species is? This is going to be the end of the video. I will see you all in class tomorrow.